and the brain is the final battleground for data, for access. It's like the one space that has not been marketed to or targeted or effectively captured by any of these players yet, and they're all vying for it.
I'm here today with Professor Nita Farahany. Nita, thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start at the start and invite you to share a little bit about who you are and your background.
It's long and vast, so I will keep it short just to say what I do is at the intersection of philosophy, law, and science, and in particular, have focused most of my career in academia at the intersection of genomics and neuroscience and neurotechnology and artificial intelligence. And because those are not necessarily three fields that go perfectly naturally together, I have worn many, many hats. And so I spend a lot of time working in different government entities and commissions. I spend a lot of time working with companies and with nonprofits and intergovernmental organizations because a lot of what I do is applied ethics. And so it's the intersection of those things. And as those technologies take off, generally you need somebody who understands all three of those aspects to come into the conversation.
Absolutely, and we're definitely lacking certain experts as technology sort of barrels forward, which is why a book like yours, The Battle for Your Brain, was so resonant for me. It came out last year, and I feel like it's only become more relevant as we've seen new advances in brain-computer interface and neurotechnology. Before we dive fully into that, I'd love to invite you just to sort of define what is neurotechnology.
Yeah, it's a good question. And maybe what do I mean by neurotechnology, right? Because there could be
Yeah.
different definitions of it. So, what I mean by neurotechnology is technology that interfaces with our brain. And that can be technology that's implanted in the brain. And that's probably the part that people are most familiar with. So, they're more familiar with something like Elon Musk talking about drilling a little, hole in the skull and putting in electrodes. That's not really what my book is about, even though I talk about those advances as well. It's really about neurotechnology for the rest of us. And the way most people, I think, really understand this is we're in an era of the Internet of Things and wearable technology. So people are used to having smartwatches or devices that can pick up things like heart rate or temperature or even, the number of steps that they've taken each day. What they're not accustomed to is those same devices having sensors that can pick up brain activity. But brain activity, like other bodily activity, can be measured and it can be decoded. And so, what neurotechnology for the rest of us really looks like are things like earbuds and headphones and watches that have sensors that primarily right now pick up the electrical activity in our brain. So, as you think, as you do anything, neurons are firing in your brain, and really hundreds of thousands of neurons at once that have characteristic brain wave activity that can be picked up by these little sensors, electroencephalography. And then, thanks to rapid advances in AI, those different patterns can be decoded and deciphered to interpret a lot of what's happening inside the brain.
Mm. And can you share a little bit about what those brainwaves are? Like, what are the different types of brainwaves, and what are the ways we have of measuring them, and what do they tell us about a given person's mental state?
Sure. So, really, your brain waves happen along five brain waves, right? So, you have like alpha, beta, delta, gamma, theta waves. And it's not that one is firing at any given time and the other ones aren't firing. It's that the amplitude and the shape of each of those different waves together give you kind of a summary of activity of what's happening across the entire brain. And so, if you have electroencephalography that's across the forehead and at different points on the scalp, it's picking up the electrical activity across the brain. And then those brain waves and the different amplitudes or the different, kind of patterns of expression can tell you things like, is a person paying attention or is their mind wandering? Is a person experiencing stress? Are they happy? Are they sad? But even more granular detail. So the more that those patterns are used and trained on AI systems. So, for example, like a person is listening to stories while their EEG activity is being recorded, and then that information is being used to train an AI, classifier that will say like, when a person's listening to a story, this is what it sounds like. This is what the brainwave activity looks like. And you do that across, hundreds of thousands of people. Eventually, you start to get to a really robust way of being able to decipher a lot more, like what does it look like when certain words are represented in the brain, or what does control of a device like up, down, left, right, or moving a cursor across the screen starts to look like.
Mm. And why is linking these different data points together able to produce such a robust fingerprint? Like, I think people think about neurotech and they're like, yeah, I don't really care if my Apple Watch knows my heartbeat or,
Right.
you know, any type of individual factor. But what is it about this sort of interconnection of those data points?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, first, it is useful to realize that there's not any data point that happens in isolation, right? So it's, what the digital era has really enabled and what these advances in algorithms enable is being able to triangulate across lots of different data points to have much greater insight. So, for example, you could take heart rate data together with neural activity, together with what is on my computer screen, together with, lots of other data points from me and get much, much better information about what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling than even a single data point like what's happening with my brain activity does. But brain activity alone also provides valuable information that you can't get just by the inferences from other data points. So, for example, heart rate tells you maybe that a person is feeling stress, or that they're exercising hard because their heart rate has increased or the pattern of heart rate activity has changed. So you can make inferences about what a person is experiencing mentally, physically, emotionally from their heart rate. You get much more precise data from the brain, though, which is the central nervous system. It's sending the commands everywhere else in the body, and you can use that to learn not just things like automatically that are happening in the body, but also make inferences about what a person is thinking and feeling at a more granular level. That's something that isn't expressed in other parts of the body. So, if you think about yourself just sitting quietly and thinking, that's pre-behavioral information. You're not expressing it by typing something on the computer. You're not expressing it by variability in your heart rate. You're just sitting there thinking. And that's where brain sensors might enable even some of the aspects of the thought or experiences that you're having to be decoded directly by being able to capture that information and then be processed by increasingly sophisticated AI systems that are able to decode what that means.
Mm. And again, kind of getting to this maybe misconception that people might have, like you referenced Neuralink and that being this operative example, like this brain computer interface. What are some other examples of devices and technologies that are currently available that people are using, that fall under this category of neurotechnology?
Yeah, then it gets to the question of like who's defining it, right? So some people would argue that something like the Apple Vision Pro is a brain computer interface device. And the reason is because it has eye tracking data, and that eye tracking data is used to be able to select and move around the screen. Together with the other sensors that it has, that's able to decode at least basic intentionality from the brain. And so, in some ways, could be thought of as a crude brain computer interface device. Um, and other people might argue that even your phone is a form of a neurotechnology device because it can capture information and make inferences about what you're thinking and feeling at any given time based on how you're interacting with the device. I wouldn't go that far. I think you need some form of a sensor that is picking up bodily functions and bodily activity, and then being able to decode it to make inferences about brain and mental states. And it gets to this distinction between, is there a much bigger class of devices that we might think of as capturing something called cognitive biometrics, right? Biometrics that can be used to make inferences about brain and mental state, versus neurotechnology, which we might think of as a narrower class of devices that can pick up direct measurements of brain activity, whether from the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system, and then make inferences about brain and mental states based on those direct measurements rather than indirect measurements. I tend to think like, it depends on what the context is that you're having the conversation for how narrowly or how broadly you want to define it. If you're trying to talk about what the growing capabilities in the digital era are of being able to decode what a person is thinking and feeling, you might go so far as to say like every interaction we have with AI or every interaction that we have with AR device, VR device, or computer enables that to happen. But I think at the very least, most augmented reality, virtual reality devices are increasingly being developed with sensors that allow direct and sometimes indirect, but sensor based measurements of what's happening in the body as a form of interface with other kinds of technology.
Mm. I was excited to ask you about spatial computing actually because, um, with Vision Pro out, it's changed how the public is thinking about spatial computing, and I'm wondering what your sense has been if you see the Vision Pro as something that is maybe encouraging the implementation of neurotechnology in society, or if you see any ways in which it's slowing it down or sort of like hitting a break because people are now looking at this device attached to other people's faces and thinking, oh, that looks a little weird, or I don't think I'd want to use that or whatever. Like, what's your, I don't know, finger to the wind on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought a year ago that spatial computing would have a faster trajectory than it has right now. And I think most people in the field would have felt the same way. Like there was a moment before ChatGPT really launched that the only thing anybody wanted to talk about was metaverse and spatial computing and XR. And I think that moment is past, right? And it has not gone as fast as anybody thought. I think Apple could change that because, if they are successful in bringing a broader market product, not the Pro at the $3,500 price point. But anything Apple does, they're going to have a good form factor. They're going to figure out a good experience for the individual and interacting with it. So things like transparency mode, or even just being able to figure out how to make it lighter, more compact, keep more data on device, offer a more privacy forward way of thinking about the technology. I think that's likely to be a game changer. In general, I think when the major tech companies launch these products, they normalize the technology in ways that the smaller companies have a harder time doing. So in many ways, I think what it signals it's coming, it's not here yet. And from a neurotechnology perspective, I think Apple and Meta are set to really normalize neurotechnology in ways that make me worried, frankly,
Mm,
right? Because I don't think that we've gotten it right yet for what that should look like with respect to rights for individuals or treating it differently. And I worry that, when Apple launches what is a crude brain computer interface device and most of the public doesn't recognize it as that and just normalizes the increased use of sensors, or, breaching this new frontier of being able to do eye tracking and pick up mental inferences without even thinking about like, wait a minute, this is different. This is a new category of data that's, and, the kind of final frontier of privacy that which just got blended into everything else that I gave up. That worries me a bit. So I think it signals probably both the slower progression in spatial computing, but what's likely to be an inflection point coming soon when they finally figure out how to make it a mass market product.
mm.
And I
Yeah.
mean, for the most part, I don't hear people saying like, wow, that looks so weird on people's faces. If anything, I hear people saying like, I wish I could get my hands on one because I'd love to try it and experience it. And I've never been on a plane and seen somebody have an Oculus on their head, but I've now been on multiple flights where I see people with, an Apple Vision Pro on their head, and that's a normalization and a cultural normalization that starts to make it far less, I think, strange for people to imagine a future in which they engage in more spatial computing, even outside of the home in a specific gaming environment, right? Literally being on an airplane, deciding, like, I'm going to watch a movie while I'm on the airplane with my spatial computing glasses on.
Yeah, actually, I'm one of the super weirdos who, back in the days of the Gear VR, I would,
Yeah.
when I was, this was back when I was working as a journalist covering virtual and augmented reality as my focus. And so I would bring the Gear VR on the plane and, test out experiences. But one thing I did on the plane at the time that I still think is kind of um, a special thing that happened because now, because of the Vision Pro, you could never do this and expect the outcome that I got, which is that the Gear VR, because it had a Samsung phone and in the back, and an outward facing camera, it had a pass through feature. So I would
Mm.
actually, in addition to doing doing experiences, I would activate the pass through feature,
Yep.
and see people looking at me in this kind of like freaked out zoo animal type of way. So the norms were
Whereas, I
definitely
mean, I
not
just
there.
don't see people looking at them in the same strange way when
Totally.
people are in transparency mode with Apple. So, um, yeah, I mean, I had the first pair of Google glasses back in the day. And, you know,
Glassware.
I yeah,
Yeah.
right? Truly, right? I mean, it didn't do anything except for cost me like $1,000, I think is what it was at the time. But, but I remember the backlash at the time that people felt over Google Glass. And it's funny because, would anybody blink or think twice now if it was introduced into today's era? Because, the idea that somebody would have a camera at all times recording, we've just normalized that risk now. People are used to anytime anything is happening in the streets, you see 1,000 cameras like pop up and recording of the incident, and it's just expected.
Mm, totally. I want to go back. You brought up Meta, and you have this really powerful anecdote when that you sort of get into the book with control labs. So
Yeah.
I'd love if you could share that anecdote.
Yeah, I mean, that was my aha moment, right? And it was funny because, he didn't know he was gonna be in my book. I didn't give him a heads up for it, and he got told by other people later that he was in the book. But yeah, so I was, at a conference at Wharton, and, it was a kind of day-long event on neuroscience and society and business. And this guy stands up, to give his presentation. And he was like, why are we humans such clumsy input devices, right? No, no, clumsy output devices. He was like, we're great at input, right? We get tons of information out, but we are really bad at getting information out of our brains. And, he talked about how, like, on the iPhone, we've gone backwards in time. We're now typing with, two thumbs instead of with all of our hands. And so we're getting worse, not better with technology. And then he was like, what if instead of these sledgehammer like devices at the ends of our arms, we could operate octopus like tentacles with our brains instead? And then, he had these videos of the watch and the control lab device of showing neural interface using EMG in the form of a watch. And it was a really powerful aha moment for me because I had been tracking neurotechnology for years and had started more than a decade before then looking at the ways in which neurotech was being used in the criminal justice system and how criminal defendants were coming into the criminal courtroom. So I had really taken a keen interest in neurotech and the potential misuses of neurotech by government entities in law enforcement settings. But I didn't worry about it that much because it was like, there's nothing that's going to make this go totally mainstream. It was silly looking forehead bands that were super uncomfortable, that had really poor signal to noise, kind of outputs. The applications were incredibly niche. It was, maybe you could fly a like little helicopter around your house and it'd be fun for novelty, or you could do limited meditation, but you'd put it on for a few minutes and you would take it off. It wasn't something you would wear all day. And there were like, two or three things that I thought were just powerfully different that made this the aha moment. One was the form factor. And I just hadn't thought really about neurotech embedded in everyday devices like a watch or earbuds or headphones. And so when I went home, I dove in like, what is happening in this space? That's amazing. But the second was neural interface. And I had really understood neural interface from the implanted brain computer interface category, but I'd never really thought about it from the everyday use of neural interface as potentially being more powerful or more seamless. And he was talking about typing on a keyboard and on a virtual keyboard, right? Typing without actually typing, and then typing just by thinking about doing so. And I was like, yeah, I get it, right? I totally get how this will become mainstream. And I see how control labs, like that's going to be the pivotal acquisition in neurotech. As soon as they are acquired, that's going to go mainstream. And that's what's going to make this become a real issue. So that's when I started like doing really deep research and started to write the book, was at that moment in time. And then the more I learned, the more I was like, wow, I'm onto something here. Like this is really coming. I'm looking at all these patents. I'm seeing a much bigger trend that's happening across the industry. And I was like, Apple's going to buy them. That's obviously going to be the case. It's going to end up in the Apple Watch. This is a no brainer. And so I was stunned when, it was like less than a year after that, I think, that Meta acquired them for 500 billion to a billion, somewhere in there. It was an undisclosed amount. And I was like, okay, game on. Like, this is happening, right? And and then understanding that its relationship to XR was really important. That being able to build from the ground up a new way of thinking about intersecting with technology. It's a lot harder to get people to replace their keyboard and their mouse with their everyday computers. But if, you know, like immersive computing and spatial computing takes off, there's no natural keyboard and mouse there, right? And a joystick is a pretty unnatural way to interact. And it's just a new place in which you could integrate these technologies so that, new category, new rules, new technology is a way to interface with it. So, then I started tracking what Apple was doing because I was like, okay, even if they didn't buy them, I'm sure that they have some plans in place. And then I found out that Control Labs did, in fact, meet with Apple, and that there were a bunch of meetings with them, and that they, I started tracking all these other companies that they were meeting with, and all the different uh, technologists at different companies who would start to work at Apple and Meta. And so I was able to glean a lot of what was happening just by watching trends that people weren't noticing. So,
Mm. And then this book emerged. Um,
yes. Okay.
and I think maybe the way into talking about the book, again, is to sort of paint pictures, because I think a lot of people have particular expectations when you're talking about neurotech or brain computer interface and thinking of that as very far out.
Yeah.
So just in a I don't know, kind of like a threats and opportunities sense, if you could sort of describe some of the things that worry you about neurotech, in a context where we haven't established norms and legal frameworks, versus the things that you would be excited about in a context where we have established, liberatory frameworks and norms.
Yeah. Writing the book, I had to really think hard about, like, am I writing about what's happening 10 years from now, or am I telling people what's happening right now and what's right around the corner? And I made the decision of right now and what's right around the corner, because so many people had this vision that neurotech is, decades off, and that it's not something that's like a real and present set of both opportunities and threats. And so most of the examples in the book are really concrete, real world examples today that are happening, just not at scale across society, to say, okay, I worry about its use for surveillance in the workplace, and introducing a new kind of panopticon that's unlike anything we've really experienced before, even though there is mass surveillance across the workplace. And describe that, how it's already happening, right? How there are companies that are already selling neurotech into companies that they've been doing that for more than a decade. That right now is for limited things like tracking fatigue levels, which I think is a pretty good use case as long as the data is kept secure. Other than that, or tracking attention, which I think is a bad use case, or using it for wellness programs and then harvesting that data to discriminate against their employees, which is again a really bad use case. A good use case, though, could be to give each of us the opportunity to use the neurotechnology even in the workplace, right? To be able to gain insights. So I talk about this in the book, like the Pomodoro method that I use, which is I keep this little cube on my desk, and I have several of them because they have different time units. And it's a great focus tool for me. It's just like a forced focus function where I'll say, okay, I'm going to do 10 minutes. And the only thing I'm doing during this 10 minutes is reading this article. And it's just a way of me being like, okay, I'm distracted by everything that's in the environment here. I can force myself to focus and pay attention. And neurotech can help us do that too. It can help us see the kinds of distractions that are happening by giving us objective data and insights into our own well being, or it can help us see stress levels. Like, I meditate and I use neurofeedback for meditation. And that's because I'm terrible at meditating otherwise. I've gotten a lot better over time thanks to neurofeedback. It helps me bring down my stress levels, and it helps me be able to modulate a lot of my pain as a chronic migrainer, and to be able to withstand a lot of pain without drugs, which have a number of side effects. I also take drugs, but that, this is an additional kind of therapy that I can use. And giving people that power to be able to see their stress levels and be able to bring down cognitive overload, that's great. So it's not that the use of neurotech in the workplace is bad. It's the use of neurotech as a tool of surveillance in the workplace is problematic. It undermines morale, it undermines trust, and it leaves people without a space for mental privacy, and is likely also counterproductive for employers who are going to end up with employees who are more stressed out, who are less productive, who are trying not to have their mind wander when they would have better insights than if you judge them this way. So that's just like one example. Or one of the things that I like years ago, as I first started to get into neurotech, I was in conversations with one of the leading, small scale neurotech companies, Interaxon, about whether they were doing these partnerships with universities, and I wanted to track attention levels of my students in my classroom, and figure out if they had real time neurofeedback, if they could use that to improve their ability to concentrate and pay attention in class, and then see what the difference would be, for example, in their test score performance at the end of the school year, having had access to it versus not. And the truth is, I just couldn't do it because I couldn't figure out a way to ethically design it. Both, from a, if I'm ever looking at the data, how am I ever, like, I could look at it post semester, but suppose it does work and it's effective. Would that mean that certain students would be advantaged versus other students who'd be disadvantaged, and the control population, et cetera, et cetera? So I never did it. But the struggle with the ethics of that left me, believing that it's very difficult to implement an ethical way to monitor students' attention in a classroom, in any instance. And then in 2019, the Wall Street Journal broke this big story about how students in Chinese classrooms were having their brain activity monitored throughout the school day, and that information was being sent to the teachers and to the parents and to the state, and that even some of the students had been punished based on what their brains revealed. And from that perspective, it's like, that's a horrible use case to me. Children deserve a space of mental reprieve. How are they ever going to achieve like self actualization if they don't have a space that they can think privately and figure out who they are? And on the flip side, on the positive, there are studies that show that children with ADHD, when given neurotechnology, used repeatedly for 20 weeks over time through a series of exercises, can actually improve their ADHD symptoms and potentially decrease the amount of drugs that they would need to take that have side effects and other kinds of issues. So again, positive, negative use case. It's not that the technology itself is bad, and it's not that it's bad for students. It's bad when it's used as a tool of surveillance or to rob people of a space where they have mental privacy. And then similarly in the government, right? Kind of same ideas where, you know, the thing that first brought me into this space was thinking about what if governments use neurotechnology to interrogate people's brains. And way back then, there were a few companies offering functional magnetic resonance imaging for lie detection, which was, kind of garbage. You couldn't show that you could really take a laboratory based lie and actually ever see that that works to tell what a real world lie looks like. But then, places like in India started interrogating criminal suspects with neurotechnology to see if their brains recognized crime scene details that happen pre-consciously with a P300 signal, a signal that happens before we're even consciously aware of recognizing an image. And that's happened with different law enforcement agencies across the world. And again, interrogating, surveilling, not giving people a space of freedom of thought, to me, that is the most fundamental aspect of what it means to be human, is to have the capacity for self-actualization and a space to do so. And any interference with that in ways that neurotechnology, I think, more uniquely enables, worries me a lot. And so it's, how do we realize all of the benefits, including lots and lots of health benefits that we could talk about, and limit the risk of the incredibly downside, oppressive nature of the technology.
Mm. I mean, that's a perfect lead into this concept of cognitive liberty that
Yeah.
you've really put forward as something that we need at a foundational legal level. So yeah, what is cognitive liberty and why is it important?
So, cognitive liberty is the right to self determination over our brain and mental experiences. And, if you go back to kind of fundamental self determination theory, it's, the basic right to be able to have, autonomy, competence, and relatedness to others. But that's interfered with by lots of different technologies, and neurotechnology could be that sort of on steroids. If you think about that from a rights perspective, that means looking at a place like international human rights law and saying, okay, there is a right to self determination that's largely been recognized until now as a political and collective right. We need to recognize it as an individual right, as the precursor to all of our other rights. There's a right to privacy. We need to explicitly recognize that includes a right to mental privacy to protect against the interferences or interception with even the automatic processes in our brains. That's always going to be a relative right. Privacy is always a relative right, which means that sometimes it may yield if societal interests are strong enough. And then freedom of thought is an absolute human right, which has traditionally been interpreted to really apply to freedom of religion and freedom of belief. And I think we need to more expansively understand what that means to include a right against interception, manipulation, and punishment for what are like our robust thoughts, what we really think of as thinking, like being a thinking human who thinks some words and images. That needs really strong protections from a freedom of thought perspective. And so we can look at that as from a rights perspective. We could look at it from what the ecosystem change is that needs to happen, right? Because there needs to be systemic change that really aligns technology with cognitive liberty. But in the book, I really unpack both what the concept is and how we would, at the very least, recognize it from an international human rights perspective. I'm working now on trying to help people really understand what it means from a foundational level. Like, what is self determination and how do you actually realize it in the digital age?
Mm. Are you able to share any of that?
Sure. So, I mean, I mentioned the kind of building blocks of self determination theory. That's not mine, right? That goes back quite a ways now. And the kind of three pieces of that around autonomy and competence and relatedness, I've, kind of updated in how I think about it from a cognitive liberties perspective, which is, your like introspection and interoception, those capabilities have really been interfered with and undermined in many ways in the modern era. Competence is really about critical thinking skills, mental agility, resilience, and relatedness is about relational autonomy, our relationship between self, our relationship to other people, and our relationship to technology. And if you break down those three categories of thinking of like the self with respect to interoception, critical thinking skills, and relatedness, you can see how technology in many ways has interfered with each of those. You can also see how technology could be designed and aligned to improve each of those. And so a lot of the modern literature that looks at like the anxious children, the mental health problems, most of them can be categorized on where it's interfering with basic self actualization and how we could realign it along those three pillars of self actualization.
Mm. I'm excited to read and learn more about that. Um,
Thanks.
you,
It's fun
you
reading. It's
right.
it's like a lot, so I'm trying to, put it in a way that is understandable and accessible, and that's not easy. So,
I mean, I feel you. But it's so critical. Like one thing I find very kind of strange about this particular subject is it's seemingly both very like not to be sort of alarmist, but it's like something that we really need to get right quickly, but also something that's not really on most people's minds. Like that
right,
disparity, like for instance, a lot of people know climate change is a big issue and it's on their minds, whether or not they're
right.
doing anything about it. But this has this weird disparity to it.
Well, they have at least this piece of it, right? So, I mean, if you look at what the Surgeon General just did in the US to say, like, there should be warning labels on social media, to me, that's like, okay, that's first of all unlikely to work, but second, that's just like such a tiny part of a much bigger problem. A friend of mine recently was pushing back on me on me coming down on TikTok for a platform, for example, and saying, "Isn't it really the phone that's the problem? Right? The fact that it's ubiquitous, we have it at all times. Like, those are the bullets, these are the guns." And I wanted to say, no, 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 that can't possibly be true. It's really the bullets, not the guns, and these aren't the guns and the right way to think about it. But maybe that's also the right way to think about it, right? And
Mm.
so if we have ubiquitous technology that's part of our everyday lives, That's probably not going to change. We're not going to go backwards and not have that technology in our pocket all the times. But there is something about the ubiquitousness of it that we have to think about beyond social media, and to think about what it's doing to our fundamental capability for self actualization. I think most people, it's on their minds that they're addicted to their technology. They don't fully understand what the harm of that is. They get climate change, like they get, when they see ice caps melting, when they see that it's super hot outside, when there's really crazy weather patterns, they understand it. They get that they're addicted to their phones, but they don't get what the harm of that is.
Mm,
And I think helping people to understand, here's what self-actualization looks like. Here's how that's being undermined. Like one example I've come across in writing this next book, interoception. I mentioned this is a word most people don't know, but it's the like ability to actually body scan to, kind of know what's happening physically in your body. The classic test of this is like, can you sense your own heart rate? But and like even more basic one is like, can you tell when you need to pee? Right. And most people can. Kids who are on social media right now, or like long gaming stretches, are urinating on themselves because they literally don't have the interoceptive capability to tell when they need to urinate. That's an incredible example of like what happens when interoceptive capabilities are interrupted, one of the fundamental building blocks of self-determination. And so the more I can help people see it that way, right? Like if your kid just literally peed on themselves and they are a teenager because they couldn't tell that they needed to, or you have a grouchy kid who like literally doesn't eat or drink water or something, like there are more and more of these examples that are happening which are about the interruption of self-actualization.
wow. I'm just struck by that example.
I mean, I was blown away as I came across a few of these, and there was a kid who I interviewed for it, um, who was willing to, tell his story for the book, and I was like, wow, right? I mean, and he wasn't the only one, right? I mean, I started to find more and more kids like that, and you just think, what more stark example can we provide to people about like truly losing the capacity for self-determination, right? Cognitive liberty is not, realigning technology with cognitive liberty would be, technology is not designed to interrupt your interoceptive capabilities. It's not designed to literally disconnect you from yourself. And you need that as a basic fundamental precondition of being able to survive, right? If you can't pick up on your basic bodily cues, you can't survive.
Yeah. How did they, if you're able to or willing to share, maybe maybe you're not able to, but I'm really curious if they described it as like some at some physical level knew but were ignoring an impulse, or if they actually weren't getting the signaling at all. Like how were they describing that happening?
He described it as not getting the signal. Like literally, it's not like, oh, I could tell, but I just held it because I wanted to get through this next, kind of part of the game. It was, I literally didn't sense it. And it's interesting because, you know, sometimes I've seen this with my own 9-year-old. We'll let her play Roblox or Minecraft for 30 minutes a day. And at the end of a 30-minute session, she will be like, I have to go to the bathroom right now. And she will like run to the restroom. And I've asked her a couple of times, like, did you not notice that you needed to go to the bathroom? And it's not that she was holding it knowing that she had 30 minutes, because I will toll the clock for her and let her go and come back. It's that like all those signals are just shut down. And then you take away the device and suddenly like, oh, there's my body again. That's a problem. It's a problem that persists even when people come off of technology. So you might sense that you need to go to the bathroom when you come off the technology, but the weakening of those interoceptive capabilities has lasting impacts across our life and livelihood. And so it's been fun to dive into. It's been scary to dive into, but it's been fun to dive into to really unpack, not just from a rights perspective of what cognitive liberty means, but why cognitive liberty is fundamental to, it is the capacity for self actualization, and why it's being in many ways undermined and interfered with with our current iteration of technology.
Mm. So that's really getting at the ways in which that mental manipulation can impact your internal experience, but there's also then these questions around your external experience.
Right.
So
And
what are
that's
the yeah.
that's the whole third category, right? It's this whole idea of like relatedness, or relational autonomy. We don't exist in a vacuum, right? We exist both in relationship to self, but in relationship to each other, in relationship to our technology. And so that's a big third category too.
Mm. So what are I mean, again, asking for like the accessible picture painting that you do so well in the book, what are some of the dangers to be cognizant of around corporations and governments having access to this type of information?
Yeah. So much, right? We can unpack one of them. Like the chapter on mental manipulation was probably my hardest chapter to write in the book. And I remember just feeling like so excited and pumped when I finally felt like I had, gotten it down to be able to describe the landscape of what was happening, but also to describe where and how we could draw the line. So, one example is neuromarketing. How do we think about neuromarketing? So, neuromarketing is using how our brains react to things like advertisements or to, whatever product placement or product pricing. Because consumers are inherently bad at self reporting about that. So, consumers will say that they like something or they'll say that that's how much they'll pay for it, but it doesn't align as well with how they actually behave. And so, a while ago, probably almost 20 years ago, as the field of neuromarketing really started to gain roots, there were some studies that started to show real insights that were powerful about things like brand associations and what impact that had on the brain of being able to change not just how a person bought or what their behaviors were, but longer term associations of products. So associating Apple with creativity or associating Coca-Cola with more of a nostalgic experience and how that activated that part of people's brains that led them to be more likely to choose Coca-Cola versus Pepsi when it's on the stand, or pricing your wine higher, leading people to be more likely to experience it as being a finer wine, even if it's exactly the same wine priced at a lower price point. And so in that chapter, I get into both neuromarketing and how that's driving a lot of our behavior, and it's informing a lot of commercial design to be able to, figure out everything from what product packaging looks like to what should appear in your social media feed, but how we might become unwitting and closed loop participants in a neuromarketing scheme. So now imagine you are wearing a neurotech device, you're on a Meta website or asset like Instagram or Facebook, and you're served up advertisements. And it isn't just how long you spend on the advertisement, literally what your brain-based reaction is to the advertisement. And they can have access to all of that and then change your feed and change your environments in real time to manipulate and change how you feel or how much time you spend on the device or what you buy or how you behave. To me, that isn't just traditional advertisement. It starts to look a lot more like manipulation, especially with all of the other constructs that they put into the system. One of the creepiest examples that I came across was dream marketing. And this to me is chilling because Coors decided that they were tired of being shut out of the halftime show for years. They wanted to have some new marketing gimmick. So they paired up with a sleep researcher who was able to tell when people were in the most suggestible stages of sleep. So if you think about when you're falling asleep, there's a part where you're more awake, you're more aware of what's happening, but you're still asleep, right? You're more suggestible at that point based on what's happening with brain activity. And they started to experiment with this to see, could you play soundscapes to have people associate cores with like mountains and running streams for the crispness and the freshness and the refreshing quality of cores. And they found they were able to successfully do this with the willing participants who were part of the sleep study. So then my brain goes to the dystopian place of this. I see places that are selling sleep earbuds now that track EEG activity. And they're meant to be worn comfortably at night. They track your patterns of sleep activity, which means they can pick up those states of mind when you are the most suggestible and when your conscious mind is basically checked out. sell that as an advertising spot to Amazon, who has, their Alexa or Echo in your bedroom. And what's to keep them from playing a soundscape and marketing to you, or, worse, an authoritarian government from trying to brainwash you while you're in a more suggestible state of sleep. And I give these examples because, first, my brain goes there. But second, because I think it's important to recognize there's nothing that stops that from happening, right? We don't have rights that actually prevent that. And when people think like, oh, that's creepy, but nobody would ever do it, why not, right? If they think that you're in the most suggestible state in any of those conditions, and they have the data and they're commodifying the data in the same way that they've commodified all of the rest of our data, and they have this much more precise metric that they can use, you can bet that they will do so to the extent that they can without you being aware of it even happening. So I get into a lot of examples like that about the both overt and subtle ways of manipulation, that neurotechnology could both be misused, but also neuroscience more generally, right? When I'm talking about the battle for your brain, I'm talking about more generally the multifaceted ways in which technology, and the brain is the final battleground for data, for access. It's like the one space that has not been marketed to or targeted or effectively captured by any of these players yet. And they're all vying for it. And we should be just as like, we should be vying just as hard as all of the rest of them to win this battle, so that any of this technology that develops is for our benefit, so that we can use it to improve our self-actualization, that we can improve our own experience of life rather than being oppressed by the technology.
Mm, I so appreciate that. And it's also reminded me of like, I think this was in the 80s or 90s, but like the the whole idea that you could like learn a language or like listen to a book while you were sleeping, and like
Right.
maybe there being a there, like if we do live in, a pro-social, you know legal and regulatory framework around this technology, maybe people really could start, using that data to, yeah, learn that language, or like, you know
Yeah, totally. Right. I mean, like, I think a lot of the dream researchers have been really investigating positive use cases, like trying to break addiction, and they've had some success in doing so, of being able to use that more suggestible time to, like, when people voluntarily are like, yeah, I want to break my addiction, to be able to use dreamscapes as a way to be able to, combat addiction. That's exciting, right? Therapeutics, helping people overcome PTSD, using it as a space for being able to recognize we are asleep, and maybe we can learn a foreign language, and maybe we can overcome traumatic memories, and maybe we can better consolidate our memories, or maybe we can figure out a way to have restful sleep and study for our exams while we're sleeping, and then spend our daytimes like enjoying life. That would be great, right? I'm not, again, opposed to us accessing and finding ways to improve our brain and mental experiences. In fact, I'm all for it. Like, part of self-determination over our brain and mental experiences is us being able to use technology or use advances in neuroscience to improve our mental experiences and our mental condition. I think the whole experience of being human is this drive toward enhancement, but not when it is, forcible, coercively, or through surveillance by others.
mm. And that's where the philosophical foundation of the book, I think, is so critical. Like, you do a really, it's been commented, and I'll sort of echo the comment that the book's very even-handed, and you do a really wonderful job weaving together the sort of threats and opportunities and positive use cases with the things to be concerned about. But underlying that is this philosophical and ethical approach to the technology. And so there's sort of a two-part question to this. One is actually very specific, is if you could share where and how John Stuart Mill intersects with these questions, because I was delighted to see him come up a few times
Yep.
in the book. But then also thinking about the complexity of like, how do you then go from a philosophical position to implementing that in a regulatory context, because that seems to me to be quite a complicated thing to try to do. And you referenced earlier that you're starting with international human rights law, but inevitably there are many approaches to this.
Yeah, great question. So, first, I'm a philosopher, right? And so a lot of the lens by which I'm approaching these issues is philosophical, but I'm also a practical ethicist as a lawyer and a law professor. And so it gives it probably a different flavor than a traditional philosophical approach to it. Mill was in many ways my inspiration for it from the get go. So, the original title for the book was On Cognitive Liberty. And it was structured in many ways around on liberty. And it's still structured in many ways around on liberty, even though it's looser and you don't see it as much. So, if you look at the parts of on liberty and you look at it like vis-a-vis self, vis-a-vis others, and vis-a-vis government, and then a kind of big chapter on freedom of thought, I break it down in many ways that same way, which is us, which is self access and the right to enhancement and the right to self diminishment. Others, which I really focused on corporations in this instance. So looking at your brain at work and other corporate uses through neuromarketing. And then vis a vis government, where I look at things like Big Brother and Bewilderbeast as the, kind of structures for that. And it followed in many ways the structure of Mill's book in earlier iterations that then got reshuffled. Over time, I think I saw the places where I parted ways with Mill, and so it's more of like a shout out to Mill than really being kind of deeply embedded in Mill. But I definitely think that like enhancement and diminishment and my approach to it is more libertarian of a take than most people. And so there you see a kind of stronger Millian approach to this, which is drawing from this idea that people should have a strong aspect of choice, and that choice really is only balanced by a harm principle, like when it actually causes a risk or harm to others. I probably have a more robust and bigger concept of harm than Mill did. And so
Mm.
there's more places that I think intervention by society or balance with society makes sense. I also draw from a lot of other philosophers throughout the book, right? Because I gain inspiration from many of those philosophers. Harry Frankfurt has long been, someone who has inspired me in thinking about concepts of freedom of will and freedom of action, and other philosophers of mind. So it takes all of those, but then it tries to translate it very concretely into law, right? And that's where the kind of practical law professor in me comes out. But probably more than even law professor, the person who has spent a lot of time in government commissions and working with legislators and working much more concretely with companies to say, there's a way to do this specifically and concretely, right? Here's what it looks like to update literally these instruments in international human rights law and how you would use this framing of cognitive liberty to get there. Here's what it looks like in the employment context and what the specific rights are that an individual needs, and how you implement mental privacy to align with things like notice and disclosure and other pieces like that. Or here's what the limitations should look like and how you would implement mental privacy when it comes to something like dreamscapes, or how you put manipulation as a concept into law and recognize that where we ethically might come out may be different than where we would legally draw the bright line, which is a lot harder. And so my mental manipulation chapter is the legal bright line rather than the ethical bright line of what I think of as manipulation. And so I try to take those philosophical concepts, make them accessible so that we understand what the normative underpinning of these legal choices are that we need to make, but then also offer very concrete suggestions of, and here's how you do it.
Mm. Mm. I saw that you studied that your area of emphasis was philosophy of biology.
Yeah,
Do you feel like that informed your approach to this particular subject?
probably. Probably. I did. I did a lot of philosophy of mind and philosophy of biology together, but I spent a lot of time reading like Hume and concepts of causation. I think are deeply important to me. But I'm also one of the things that philosophy of biology and philosophy of science teaches you well is to take a very analytical and critical approach to claims that are made in scientific studies, right? To not treat science as if it's a holy grail, but also to understand the construct of science itself. And that probably has changed the way that I read most studies and most articles, but also the enterprise of science itself, to realize it's not inevitable. Like the progression of science in this field isn't just an inevitable, it is contingent, and it's a set of contingencies that we can make choices about. So
Mm. Mm. Okay, so it's been over a year since the book came out.
yes.
Have there been any developments, or moments in the news or anything that in that time have changed your thinking, confirmed your thinking? Like, yeah, I just want to open up that space.
So first, the paperback version of the book comes out in July, and in the paperback version, there's a new chapter. because I negotiated with the editor and the publisher to say, like, there have been some developments that changed my thinking a little bit on some of these issues that I would love to be able to include within it. Nothing that changes fundamentally. Like, happily at this point, I think I was largely right about almost all of the predictions I made, which is kind of amazing, right? Because you're kind of making these bold predictions about a field that is developing, and hoping that there aren't major, like, Meta could have shut down Reality Labs and decided that they weren't going to go in that direction, or et cetera, et cetera. Lots of things could have happened which haven't panned out yet. Instead, you just see more and more brain drain happening to these companies in those spaces, and more convergence. But I write a little bit about the Apple Vision Pro in that new chapter. I also write about some of the big studies that have come out with generative AI. So, one of the limitations in this field, I think, has been every brain is a little different. And, the capability of having a mass market product has been challenging for most technologists to say, like, okay, well, how do you ship something like the Control Labs product and have it actually work well out of the box so that the user experience is the same across everybody who unbox it, but it's not so limited in its functionality that literally the only thing you're doing is up, down, left, right. And in which case, like, is this really a huge innovation? And I think being able to have on device large language models, and just large language models straight up, period, changes the ball game for personalized neurotech. And some of the studies that came out, like the study from Alex Huth's lab that applied fMRI to GPT-1, both for encoding and decoding their models, and had like unbelievable success relative to what had come before in being able to do real time, like continuous language decoding from the brain. And then another EEG study with a similar methodology that's still in preprint, but looks like it's going to have similar results to that. And then you hear at places like Meta during the Meta Connect conference, them talking about the capability of having these devices co evolve with you thanks to those advances, which is out of the box you may be able to do things like left, right, up, down, but that with a large language model on device that is able to learn you as you go so that it is a co-evolving process and the devices get better and more precise over time. Each person will have their own classifier on device that will enable them to be able to really have much more rapid gain of function. And then there's a more recent paper that came out that shows that, and that might be translatable across people. And so I think what we're going to see is really rapid advances once you have the first generation of products that get out, because you'll have a much bigger training set, and the capacity to take that training data and use it to translate across people with minimal additional training data from the next person means I think we're going to see, kind of exponential growth in ways that I didn't even expect for their capabilities. And I was really careful in the book to not say mind reading. Like, I was just super careful. I was trying not to overclaim. I was trying to be careful in the claims. And those studies changed my mind some. I mean, I think we're getting closer to not mind reading in the sense of like literally everything you think and feel, but more powerful decoding than I thought a year out would be possible.
Mm. Yeah, because I know a lot of the critique is that grand claim, much weaker actual, evidence or conclusion. And that, that's the critique of many of the much of the surveillance software that's used, particularly in law enforcement or like in workplace
Yep.
surveillance. But it sounds like maybe those critiques are going to apply less as we push deeper into a context of generative AI.
We'll see, right? There you still have the problem of EEG being a signal that's, summing information from across the entire brain, but that doesn't exist in isolation, right? You've got on-device cameras, you've got eye gaze, you've got, EMG plus EEG. I think it's hard to imagine we don't quickly get to a place with how rapid the advances are with generative AI that you start to see real advances in decoding capabilities. So, we're not there yet, but I think it's going to happen a lot faster than people assume because of how quickly it's happening. I mean, if you think about it, right, predictive text helped, but generative AI for predictive text with context and iterative context updating means that you can decode so much faster, right, language from the brain than you ever could before with so much greater precision.
Wow. Well, I'll keep an eye out. I have 3 questions that I like to ask every guest.
Okay.
You've definitely, hit these in the course of the conversation, so feel free to repeat yourself or extend something that you've already said. But what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that I could limit myself really easily to one, but here's what I'll say, which is the one thing I wish people would pay more attention to before they buy a neurotech device is the privacy policy. And that's because there are some companies out there right now that are saying your data is your data. And in particular, your sensor data is your data. We will keep it on device. We won't sell it to third parties. We won't sell it for targeted advertisements. And those are the companies that I want us with our feet to be voting for, right? With our dollars and feet, to prioritize supporting those companies in a very nascent field where it could go any direction.
Mm. Could I also ask a follow up question, which is, are there any specific companies you would call out as being like 2 thumbs up, doing a great job on the transparency and policy front?
Nope.
Okay.
I don't want to name names.
Yeah. Well, good to know there's at least some.
There are some. There are some, and I'm impressed with the some that are being more thoughtful about it.
Great. What is one resource you would recommend for making better sense of reality?
It's really hard to find one resource in this because what is reality is such a hard thing to get a grasp of. Right now, I'm really liking Anil Seth's work. And in particular, I like his newest book that's out, Being You. And I think what I really like about that is it gives you real insights into like robust, scientifically grounded understanding, a perspective on reality. And a perspective on reality and our place in the world and our brains and like how it works. And so I'm digging that right now as a good way of trying to get a better grasp on reality.
Amazing. Yeah, I love his work. I spoke at an event with him in 2019, and that's when I was introduced to it, and it's really, really special scholarship.
Yeah.
Um, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
I was in this car accident when I spun off the road and went down a steep embankment, and my car spun like 3 or 4 times down off of a highway, down to the bottom of the steep embankment. And I still vividly remember it. It's been almost 2 decades since, and I like time slowed down and everything was slower. And I just remember thinking, wow, this is how I'm going to die. I didn't expect that. But like this like perfect clarity of thought in this moment when my car was spinning out and going down to the bottom of the hill, and I very easily could have died. I didn't. I'm here. In case you missed that part, in case your reality check, needs updating. But I did get a wicked case of poison ivy from that. So I like once I sort of, got my bearings, I climbed up the hill, back up to the highway, where I apparently went through a huge patch of poison ivy and ended up, with the worst case of poison ivy imaginable on steroids for like a month after that. But it could have been much worse. I'm grateful for the for that rather than something else. So that was an interesting change in my perception of time.
Wow. Yeah. It's also, it reminds me of sort of the t-shirts. Like, I went on the da 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 and all I got was this stupid, like,
All I got with this stupid poison ivy. Yeah, exactly. Near death experience, and all I have to show for it is the worst case of poison ivy ever.
yeah. Um, okay. Well, I'm so grateful you were able to take some time to talk about this. Obviously, we've just scratched the surface, which is why people should go buy Battle for Your Brain, especially knowing that there's a paperback edition coming out.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to share when specifically that's coming out?
I think it's July 7th or 12th. I don't know. I should know the date of it, but it's sometime early July.
Amazing. And yeah, any other stuff you wanted to call out or places people can find you?
These days, I'm most active on LinkedIn rather than other platforms. I used to be on X, and well, and I haven't found a place to express myself. I also have a Substack that I sort of sometimes right on called Thinking Freely that people could check out.
Amazing. Well, Nita, thank you again so much for being on Age of Futures.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. A podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.